Welcome to Shidduch University Shidduch U. Hi, I'm Devora Krasnianski, and in this series, I invite experts and professionals to talk about all aspects related to Shidduchim, dating, and relationships. Today, we're talking about dating anxiety with Professor Naomi Klapper from Touro University. I want to thank Naomi Klapper from Mask Parents for co-sponsoring this episode. Mask provides mental health resources for our firm community, including a weekly radio show, support groups, school programs, a confidential hotline, and much more. You can reach them at maskparents.org. In this episode, Professor Klapper described why so many people have such anxiety when dating. It's fascinating that when anxiety goes up, it just washes out the attachment hormones that bring people together. Also, when people are anxious, our thinking is affected and we really can't get fully present for the relationship or to make the important decisions. So it's really important to address anxiety so that you can actually develop the relationship and come to the chuppah. Professor Klapper also shares some key tools to overcome anxiety. This is an important episode for all daters, even if they aren't terribly anxious.
Naomi, I'm so excited to be talking to you about this important topic. Today I'm with Naomi Klapper, Professor Naomi Klapper from Touro, and you'll tell us a little bit more about what you do. But I know you've done a lot of work helping a lot of young people, or not even so young people, get through the dating process and get to the other side and actually get married and be successfully married. So you've done a lot in this area. So I'm really excited that you're here to talk to us about this, specifically talking about dating anxiety. I know you do a lot of other work, but we're going to kind of narrow in and hone in on dating anxiety, what it is, what we can do, how we can overcome it, how we can avoid it to begin with. So I'm really excited about that. But before we have this conversation, could you really talk about some of the work that you've been doing in this area?
Sure, absolutely. So my background is I'm a licensed therapist. I also teach psychology. I've been at Touro College. I'm chair of the department, and I supervise the internship program, and I am a professor there. I've been a professor of psychology for over 37 years. And I also have a private practice. My private practice is primarily on the Upper West Side, but I do have a satellite office in Teaneck, New Jersey. And I've been working with individuals and couples for decades now, not to date myself. And I really find that some people can be very successful in their life and harness anxiety to be their most productive self. You know, students very often will admit that when they have that extra edge of anxiety, they do their best work. But in relationships, which we can discuss later why, it actually can be counterproductive. And certainly when we're fighting and we're flooded in any relationship or married, we know that sometimes the things we say when we're so intense in our feelings are actually the worst ways to handle it or the worst things to say. So in my practice, I work with, all types of psychological issues, not just dating issues, primarily with individuals and couples. And I do find that working and helping people understand their specific subtext for why they're anxious and overcoming anxiety has really helped them break through this wall of moving forward, feeling emotionally, connecting emotionally, and being able to get married. I have couples I've worked with who thank God, get married in their 30s and 40s and even 50s who were never able to do so because they didn't realize that their anxiety was really getting in the way and some of their thinking patterns and some of their patterns in general. So we can discuss that about what can people do and what might be getting in their way.
So I'm really excited to be talking about that. So when we say the word dating anxiety, what is it that we're talking about today? And is it a clinical term? Let's talk a little bit more about that.
Okay, absolutely. So let me describe relationship anxiety. A lot of people do use it almost like a diagnostic term. In fact, relationship OCD, ROCD, is now a diagnostic term, but some people want to know if it's more of a situational experience. So first of all, I'd like to reframe anxiety. Not all anxiety is negative. Anxiety can, like I mentioned before, help us be more productive or do things with anxiety that we couldn't do before, pull through. We've all had those experiences with adrenaline has helped us do things that we didn't think we were able to do. Anxiety is a response to our thoughts. It's a physiological arousal. It's a really a physiological state that we all have. I want to mention that all thoughts have a physiological response, not just anxiety. I'm sure you've on occasion thought of something sad and then you realize you have tears in your eyes, or we might dream that we're falling and then our muscles kind of twitch because we brace ourselves for the falls. So we all have involuntary, uncontrolled physiological responses to our thoughts, and our body responds, and to a large extent, those responses can be very productive. So when we have anxiety, our body gives us additional cortisol and adrenaline. We literally go into this fight or flight mode that is involuntary. Very often it's triggered in an unconscious level. And on occasion, it can be helpful or even feel exciting. We've all done something that was scary, that was a little bit of a kick or a jolt, like a roller coaster, or reading a scary novel. But too much can actually have a response that's counterproductive. We have heard the term fight, flight, or freeze, that when we have too much anxiety in us, our body prepares physiologically to either fight, where muscles are really like pumped up with blood and our stomach stops digesting and sends those, blood flow to our muscles for fighting, or for running, for fleeing, running away, or for freezing, like a deer in the headlights. And these may be good in certain circumstances, like running away from a robber, fighting a tiger. But in relationships, we find that these responses that are not controllable and involuntary, this response could really be counterproductive because it actually affects our thinking. That's the interesting thing. It actually makes our thinking wonky. We become less productive. There have been cases of people in severe anxiety, like hearing a fire alarm, that will gather up their children, run out of the house, and then look around and say, "Where's Shlomi?" And they forgot one of their kids behind, God forbid. Because when we have that flooded sensation of fight or flight, we're good at running, at fighting, but we're not good at thinking. It affects our frontal lobe, our executive functioning, and we don't think as clearly. And it really can shut our thinking down. We start thinking in a calamitizing way. We start thinking in a very black and white, all or nothing type way. And what's also interesting about relationships and anxiety is, in addition to calamitizing, I'll feel stuck with him, I won't be happy, we'll fight, I'll get divorced. In addition to that type of thinking, there's another interesting part of our physiology that gets in the way. That when we have very high levels of anxiety, very high levels of cortisol or adrenaline, which are hormones that our body produces, our body shuts down the hormones that are connected to attraction, hormones such as oxytocin, which is a very famous hormone. It has its own nickname. It's called the cuddle hormone, right? But there are a lot of hormones in attraction. That's just the most famous one. And this might be a useful mechanism in general, like we don't want to be attracted to people who we're afraid of or that someone is dangerous. Unfortunately, sometimes people are actually only attracted to people who are dangerous. And that's a different conversation, perhaps for another time, of why that is. But most people, when we have this feeling of danger, of any kind of danger, this situation, being stuck in an unhappy relationship, it's like a big wet bucket of water that washes over the chemistry that we need to feel what we call chemistry, like what we feel of attraction and love. So when someone has a very high level of anxiety about making the decision, or is a very, very anxious person, this really interferes with their ability to develop a deep connection with someone else. Anxiety can shut down love. It can wash out the feelings. And I've had people who really felt very sure, and then right before they get engaged, or I've worked with people who are very happy and very much in love and excited about this person that they're going to marry. And the morning of the wedding, there's so much anxiety that they'll call and they'll say, I'm feeling nothing. This is a big mistake. I don't know what I was feeling, but I'm not. Now I'm like totally not feeling anything except anxiety. And that's the anxiety washing out the oxytocin and the dopamine and all the chemistry of love, because our body can't produce both simultaneously. So when we are very anxious, it's almost like this helicopter or this whirling tornado looking for a place to land. And when you have a very high level of anxiety, like you asked, is it clinical? What happens is that some people have such a high level of it that they become almost like OCD about the flaws. Like the helicopter is whirling, it's an anxiety helicopter or tornado, and it'll just land on all the little inevitable flaws that each person has and makes it literally unable to ignore them. And they can never move forward in a relationship because as they get more and more serious, the anxiety raises, washes out the oxytocin or the chemistry, the positive feelings they had. And now that whirling energy of anxiety is landing on every little flaw. And, you know, everyone has things. Some people have little backpacks of flaws. Some people have big steamer trunks of flaws. Everyone has flaws. And people think of, before the term relationship OCD came up, people used to call them avoidant attachment, or they used to say commitment phobic, right? Those people who could never find someone perfect enough or a situation perfect enough to make them feel safe to commit. And of course, no one is perfect. No situation is perfect. But the biological reason of the cortisol being so high, the fear so high that it washes out all the positive chemistry and makes it impossible for them to get closer because they're thinking in that calamitizing, black and white, all or nothing thinking really gets in the way. And sometimes for decades they're dating. They've dated hundreds of people and they think they just can't find the perfect person, but really it's that every flaw gets pulled into this tornado of anxiety. And by reducing the anxiety and working on their own self-soothing mechanisms and learning tools for the anxiety and calming it down, they can reduce the calamitizing thinking. They can reduce that like perfectionistic type of thinking. Their oxytocin comes back, the dopamine comes back, the chemistry of love comes back, because we've reduced the cortisol and they're able to start really, you know, connecting to people, flaws and all.
Wow. So there's this inverse of, if there's cortisol, then they can't have the oxytocin, or and so it's like sort of like the seesaw. So we have to work to get the cortisol down so that we can allow the oxytocin to come. Not necessarily will be oxytocin because it may be the wrong person, but if there's cortisol, then the oxytocin definitely can't come. Is that right?
Right. Well, there's a higher, so you asked if it's clinical or if it's just a normal thing. So everyone's going to have anxiety. You know, there are a lot of reasons why people experience anxiety when they're dating, but some people can have a normal, healthy dose of anxiety. Motivation very often is linked to anxiety. If we don't think we're going to fail the test, we're not going to study. We're not going to be motivated to study. If we don't think our boss is going to be mad at us or we may not get promoted because we didn't finish the project, we're motivated to finish the project, even if we're like, would rather go home. But anxiety can be good. But when we talk about the clinical level of anxiety, relationship OCD, we're talking about when the anxiety is so severe that it interferes with the way people think, becomes calamitizing and black and white and all or nothing. It interferes with the way their body is producing the chemistry of love. It sort of washes out all the positive chemistry and it just floods the system. And it really, you know, prevents them from being able to connect on an emotional level.
So someone who is generally not anxious, could that happen for them that they're just particularly anxious only in dating or mostly in dating?
So that's a great question. So it definitely happens that people who are not anxious in other areas of their life will struggle tremendously during the dating process. The dating process just sinks them. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I'm going to list a few, but there's actually many reasons for that. But for the sake of time, I'll just give you a handful today. I'll give you like 4 or 5. The first is that dating isn't like any other thing we've done ever before in our lives. It's probably the most pivotal decision that people need to make, right? The most permanent decision, certainly that they've ever made. A lot of people are dating and they're at 18, 19, 20, 21 years old. And before then, what have they decided? If a major, college, a career, right? Whether or not to go on shlichus. But they've had a lot of guidance making those decisions, and those decisions can be changed. We all know people who segue work experiences into other careers or segue experiences into other experiences, but marriage doesn't have that. Marriage is just, you can't segue. It's very pivotal and very permanent. To young people, they're probably the first real permanent decision they're making on their own. The second reason that people very often get much more frozen with dating than with other decisions is that other things that we have to face, we can generalize our previous successes into that area and gain confidence. So for example, if I'm going to graduate school now and I'm scared, it's a really big commitment. It's a very intense program, but I did college or I did high school and I did it well. So I know I can crack the code probably in how to succeed and how to do well in graduate school. Mm-hmm. But when we're dating and we have to, on our own, discover the real character and integrity behind the smiling face and perfectly blow-dried hair and beautiful suit. I'm describing the boys, by the way, not the girls even. Mm-hmm. And then we're like, okay, how do I know that I can trust my insights in this? This is something I've never done before. So that's, we don't have previous successes like, okay, I'm going to switch camps, but I know that I made friends in my old camp, so I'll make friends in my new camp. The third reason why dating for many people is a very difficult challenge is that many young people who have had dating anxiety that I speak to do not want the same marriages as their parents have had. And it's very clear when I ask them in our first intake together, do you want the same relationship your parents have, or in what way would you want it to be different? They are very adamant they don't want the same marriages their parents had, but they're not clear on how to avoid that. So they think, if I get the perfect person who lines up and matches me in everything, in every outlook, in every, who we like to vote for and what we like to do and, what our values are in every area, then I'll never fight about anything. And then, they don't know how to have productive fights. So they just are afraid to be stuck in a difficult situation they don't know how to navigate. So they feel like, oh, it's better for just us to match up than to say, well, of course, inevitably we're going to fight and we're going to disagree on things, but I'm going to learn how to be productive, right? And you and I both know that conflict is inevitable in all relationships. And actually conflict can lead to a lot of wonderful growth in both people. Maybe they learn to be less selfish through their conflict or listen better. Like conflict can be a people growing experience if it's done productively. But many young people haven't been modeled productive fighting. Have only been modeled destructive fighting or unhappy relationships, and it creates a lot of anxiety. So they just would prefer to try and find that perfect person. Another reason why some people find dating anxiety so challenging is that they don't realize that people fall in love or become attracted to other people very consistently with their personality, right? If you know someone who makes really gut decisions and they trust their gut decisions and they just make the most of it, they don't overthink it, then they're much more likely to connect when they're dating in that way too. They just rely on their gut. But there are people who deliberate and overthink perhaps even all the big decisions and even some small decisions. And therefore, dating is going to be the same way. This is the most pivotal decision, the decision of all decisions. So it's going to be a trigger for them to also overthink and feel anxious. But they compare themselves to what they expected to feel when they were dating, what their roommate or their sister, she knew on the second date, so I should know on the second date. Or what modern, if they're exposed to modern culture, what modern culture says about what we should feel and what kind of chemistry we should feel when we're dating. But it may not be consistent with their personality. So they're almost expecting to feel something that that's not them. Not that dating is like shopping, but I'll give you an analogy that maybe the women who are listening to this can relate to, at least. But when there are people who go into a store, they see boots on sale and they're like, I just have to have those boots. And they buy those boots and then they just make those boots work. But there are other people who go into a store and they see boots and they put them on hold. And then they go home and they check their credit card. They look in their closet. They figure out how many outfits they would have with those boots. They visit the boots the way you would visit someone in prison, like they have visitation rights with the boots and to go visit them again. And they're like really diving over this decision. And it's a relatively small decision. And they may in the end make the best decision for them, but they really work on that decision. And they're going to date in a similar way. They're going to really think and maybe even overthink or have too much anxiety about it. But I find a lot of young people keep saying, well, I'm supposed to be sure. Everyone says when it's right, you'll just know and be sure. But honestly, that may not match their operating styles, right? And we need to be honest about who we are and how we make decisions and how our general level of anxiety is and accept ourselves. And it may be okay to say that you are just the type of person who's going to have a lot of anxiety when they're dating and maybe even when they're engaged and maybe even till their wedding, because that is just the way you are with big decisions and it's okay. And the final reason why I find that dating is so hard for people, even people who don't have anxiety in other areas, is that it's a decision that they're making at the same time in their life, at the same juncture, when they're deciding a lot of other big things too, whether or not they want to live in Israel or America, have a life of learning or a life of shlichus or a profession, or apply to graduate school or what kind of career they want to have, what their hashkafa is going to be. And they're really establishing their entire adult identity. How similar do I want to be to my parents, or how different, what type of community do I want to live in later on? And everything is really now, when you date, being put into play. It's not a thought anymore. When we get married, we feel like we're sealing the commitment of those decisions, right? It's one thing to think, maybe I want a life in shlichut. But if you marry someone who that is an important value to them, that's it. You've committed not just to them, but to that life. Or if you want to live in Israel, but you're not sure you really can handle living so far from your family, and then you marry someone and that's a top priority for them, you feel like, okay, now I can't turn it around. And that's a lot of pressure because they feel like they're sealing all their adult decisions at the same time as they're committing to this person. And I think the anxiety is very often exacerbated for young people because they're making all these other decisions at the same time, and they feel like the decisions are all holding hands, right? Like they're, sort of like mountain climbers who have a rope that they're all tied to each other. Who I marry is connected to what hashkafa, what type of community, what type of future I'm going to have. Is it going to be more materialistic or more like altruistic? Like everything seems to be connected in our adult decisions to who we marry.
So there's a whole bunch of different reasons, and people come at it from different, and people can have 1, 2, or 3 of these also at the same time.
That's a very good point. It's almost a wonder why we don't all have dating anxiety when you really think about it. Like how much is at stake and how new this really adult decision is to most people. A lot of people really, their parents chose their school and their parents chose their camps, and they really haven't had practice making adult decisions.
And the first adult decision is this huge one.
Right. It's the biggest of all. It's really, there's nothing else that affects your life more than this, nothing else, but it's also very tied to our adult decision, right? If, I always tell people they should have 5 non-negotiables. You can't have 36 criteria. You have to have like your top 5. But if your top 5, if you're dating someone and one of their top 5 is living in Israel or, learning for the rest of their life, you're committing to that value, you're committing to those things, and so you're not, it's sort of compounded interest. You're not just making a decision about them, you're making a decision about all those things that are tied to them.
Right, and like you said, they didn't have experience doing that before, even on smaller things, never mind these, like you said, compounded decisions altogether. So
absolutely.
So you said earlier that sometimes anxiety could be good. Is there any way that anxiety could be good for dating?
Well, so anxiety could be good for dating. I mean, there are times that it could be helpful when we're dating, and in general. First of all, anxiety can give us an feeling that sometimes we need to listen to. Our gut, so to speak, as we call it, sometimes works faster than our mind can process, especially in times of danger. And it helps us proceed with caution. I don't know if you've ever had this experience that you'll walk into a situation and like the hair on your neck just kind of stands up, or your heart just like tightening. And you're looking around to see what's off. You haven't even figured out the problem yet. Your mind is moving slower, but your gut is already on high alert and your body is on high alert. So too in dating, sometimes there are red flags, but our families are encouraging us, and the rebbeim who suggested them are encouraging us, right? Nowadays when people date, they have these like dossiers that they call profiles or resumes, but they're like really dossiers that the FBI would envy. They have mugshots and fingerprints and data on them, reports about if they're a mensch and if they're a great guy or girl. And you're getting a lot of pressure, and parents and rabbis, are sometimes advising you, and they're all in the mix. And your gut is telling you something different, right? Your anxiety, your hair on your back of your neck is raised, and you don't know who's right, my gut or everybody else. Who am I listening to? This dossier or this feeling, this anxiety that I have? And in those situations, I tell people they should find a trusted, wise, married. And I'm going to explain married person to help and to talk to them, a sounding board that's not your parents, not someone emotionally involved, not even the shadchan, who may know them very well, not someone on their reference list, obviously for obvious reasons, but just someone sort of impartial. Why married? Because I have to tell you, and again, my practice is on the Upper West Side, so I see people of all ages, but a lot of the older singles that I see will sometimes come in and tell me how they handled something in a dating situation that was like disastrous. It definitely led to the other person breaking up with them. And I'm thinking, you're such a successful person, like in your professional life, what would make you think that this is a good idea? So I don't say that, I just ask, why did they think to do this? And inevitably they would say, oh, my friend advised me to do that. This was my friend's advice. And I'll ask, how long was your friend married? And they'll say, oh, my friend was single. My friends are single. So we know, we're so smart. We know to get advice from experts, right? I wouldn't ask an unemployed friend about how to ace a job interview. And I wouldn't ask a friend who has no money how to do investment advice. But when you ask a single friend dating advice or relationship advice, you're doing the same thing. You're asking someone who's broke how to make money. So I always tell people, you need a sounding board. Yes, that's true. But a happily married someone whose marriage you admire and who's been married for 5 years or more, a rabbi or a relative, it's like a selach harav, and then that person, I personally think that a sounding board like that is good for every situation, right? Mm-hmm. But I do hear a lot of people who need to have that. And honestly, not our parents. very often in that situation, because I find that sometimes parents, and they love their kids and they mean well, but their own anxiety can actually compound the anxiety of the person who's dating. Their own worries or even criteria, right, can compound it. You know, parents might have criteria that's slightly different than their children's criteria. So now that person who's dating has their own criteria and all the 36 items that their parents think are important too. So I find that having someone who's objective, then they don't have their own anxieties projected. You know, parents might have anxiety about money themselves, so they'll project out into their child when their child's talking about, well, he doesn't really have an idea of a parnasa yet. So we really want to sell a harav, like someone who's just impartial and a wise sounding board.
Right. So at what age do people start coming to you? Like, you know, if there's dating from 18, do people come to you at 18, or does it come a little bit later? What stage in their dating journey do they come generally?
It's a great question. And also, you know, at what stage of the anxiety do they come? You know, that's also tied to this, you know, at what stage, you know, in the dating process are they seeking professional advice, right? And I find in my practice, sometimes I see people who just have social anxiety in general, but we're able to kind of compensate. But once they started dating, the social anxiety like hit the fan. Or sometimes I feel like people date and they only know how to do the first, second, third date, but like they don't know how to get deeper. So they come when they find there's a pattern of like superficial dates, but like they never take it to the next level. Sometimes people only come to me when they have they need premarital counseling because the dating went smoothly, but now that they're actually making decisions together, decisions about money, which has a lot of subtext, and in-laws and boundaries, and, you know, very heavy decisions, they find that, you know, is really they see that they don't have the tools for that. There are a lot of motivators that bring people into therapy, but I will share with you that sometimes people don't come to do the work on their dating anxiety or their dating patterns until they're in their 30s or 40s. And then they lament, because when they're in their 20s, they feel like, oh, well, I just haven't met the person. It's not me. But then at 30 or 40, and they realize, well, the only thing that all these people have in common that I've gone out with, these 70 people, the only thing they have in common is me. So maybe I should work on me. And when they come in and they do the work and they realize that their perfectionistic thinking or anxiety was getting in the way, they do lament that I wish I would have started working on myself and my patterns earlier, because I would have had more dating options. But I have worked with people of all ages, and they do overcome their dating anxiety, and they do, Baruch Hashem, fall in love and get married and have families at all the ages I work with, which is wonderful. And sometimes people realize that they're experiencing anxiety and that it's very distressing, and they have a issue preventing them from building a rapport with another person. And they may not know the term avoidant attachment or relationship anxiety, but they do know that they have this tremendous feeling of distress whenever they're dating, and they want to alleviate the distress.
I like that word patterns. So, you know, like people, when you're 30, you may have patterns if you're willing to look at it. But someone should, I mean, like you said, people shouldn't, they lament that they wait to their 30s. So what kind of patterns could someone be looking for a little bit earlier?
Right, it's a great question. So I do think that people, so just to clarify, in terms of when they're dating, if they are dating productively and consistently with their relationship, that they find they're not calamitizing, they're not experiencing distress, they're just, you know, date in a healthy way. You know, dating is complicated. Sometimes you like the person, they don't want to continue. Sometimes they really are into you and you don't see it and you don't want to continue, right? But seems to be that at least it's productive. You know, you're not losing sleep, you're not losing your appetite, you're able to connect to people. And you overall, you just feel that it's a healthy process. Then, you know, that's something that you could probably navigate with the help of a good friend or a mentor who's married. But if you really feel that you have these patterns where you just get so anxious every time and you're feeling really upset, really burnt out, or you're repeating patterns, like you're getting in a relationship and then that person, every time after the fourth or fifth date, the person says no, and you don't know what's holding you back. Or every time you date someone, you start to notice their flaws and you can't stop thinking about their flaws. And then they move on, they get married to someone else, and you're so upset. And the same thing happens again and again, right? These patterns, it's worth exploring them. It's worth exploring them with a professional.
And also, like another pattern I find some people, at least who I work with, they can do the first 2, 3, 4 dates, but then when they have to start sharing about themselves, they just can't do it. So it's not only a social issue. It's like they just don't want to let their guard down. They feel like this person's not worth it. I don't want. I have a story that I don't want to share, and this person's not worth it, and that person's not worth it, and that person's not worth it. But it turns out that they don't want to share their story.
Right, 100%. Well, you know, it's interesting that people don't realize that the way people emotional intimacy grows is not through being perfect and not through expecting someone to be like judging them and being all conditional in their positive regard to you. It really comes from this feeling of unconditional acceptance. When I share something and it's painful or embarrassing or my flaw, and I tell someone about that, they feel closer to me because I shared it. And the fact that they accepted it and didn't judge me and didn't mock me because of it makes me feel closer to them. And relationships are built not by just having fun and going mini golfing. Relationships are built by developing this feeling that the other person has this unconditional positive regard to me, that I can tell them things about me that were challenging or that I didn't overcome at the beginning of my life, and I've learned from it. And they accept it and they support that. They feel closer that I shared it, and then they will tell me something and sort of unfurl or share something with me. And that unconditional positive regard, back and forth, I share something deeper, a little more embarrassing or a little more intimate or a little more, painful. And then they share something with me. Those are the building blocks for emotional intimacy. It's not, I'm perfect. Oh, you're perfect. Okay, we'll be the perfect couple. That's not emotional intimacy. And I find that a lot because dating is unfortunately at the beginning, certainly in this period, while at any moment someone could reject me. They could say they're a wonderful woman, but not my woman, or they're a wonderful man, but not my one man. We have Rabbinic Gershon's Zera. We only get to pick one. We that's not the one. So we are very hesitant to show our flaws. And then we don't understand why we're not getting deeper. And the relationship feels like not real, right? Because when we're with a close friend, we'll say, oh my gosh, I'm so stupid. I woke up late. I forgot about a test. And you and your friend will validate how frustrating that must have been. So that is the kind of being real is what helps us share, but we need to feel like we're in this safe space. We could see it's a paradoxical dilemma, right? We're dating, we're feeling judged, but we won't feel close to someone unless we get real.
Right, so there's a way to do it. You can just drip a little bit of information, see how it's received. As if you have to put your biggest story out up front.
Yes, 100%. It's a relationship-based decision. That's what I tell people. It's a relationship-based decision. If you have something that you really want to tell someone, that you think they're going to be upset that you didn't share it before this stage, before you get engaged, or before the 20th or 10th date, right? That it would actually be a violation of trust, then you've waited too long, right? But you really need to see, sort of read the relationship room to a certain extent. I just tell people you're looking for the right person who's going to match you, not the best girl or the best guy. This isn't an Olympic sport. You're looking for the best person for you. So you have to be you to a certain extent, because you're looking for the match for you.
Well, also the flip of that is that you want to know that they know you. because you're going to be together, whoever you marry, you're going to spend a lifetime with. So
Yes.
you want to make sure that you know that they accept the you who you really
Yes.
are.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. That they have that unconditional positive regard for you. Right? Absolutely. And if this is not something that they can quote handle, right? You're not going to be able to pretend to be someone you're not for your whole life. You can pretend to be at 3 hours in Starbucks, but you can't pretend to be something that you're not your whole life.
You wouldn't want to, and you really couldn't.
Right. Yes and yes.
Right.
Yes and yes.
So we were saying that people wait till they're a little bit older, or till they have the patterns to actually come. But I'm wondering if there's something that people can do earlier in life, even maybe before they're starting to date, to set themselves up for a more healthy dating experience without all this unmanageable anxiety.
Right. Great question. Again, I really would actually encourage people to think about setting up some of these tools even before they start dating. And really, I could suggest a lot of tools, but I don't want to overwhelm people. So I'm just going to suggest 5 or 6 things to think about, whether you've started dating or you're getting ready to date, or you're a parent and you want to help your child prepare for now. You see how complex this situation is, dating, and you want to set your child up for success. So there's actually 5 suggestions that I have, right? And they're tools for life. They're not just tools for dating, but they're tools that will serve you well in all the areas of your life. The first is that highly anxious people have not learned how to manage their anxiety. It will definitely hit the fan when they're dating, but it'll also hit the fan in other times in their life, because life is stressful. Like there's no perfect world. No one's living in Disneyland here. And even if they are, they're not living there forever. So we really need to learn how to manage our own high levels of anxiety. If people are always calamitizing, always going into the worst case scenario in their heads, then their body responds as though it's already happening, right? It's constantly raising their anxiety and they're responding as though it's already happening. And they need to learn how to reduce this calamitizing thinking, this black and white thinking, this highly anxious way of responding. So for example, if someone is dating and they're thinking of marrying someone, but that person has, a very low paying career. So someone with a low level of anxiety would think, well, I have to be okay economizing, but I'm not so materialistic and I wanted to work anyway. I wanted to have a career. But a highly anxious person will think like this. They'll think, oh, I'm going to be poor and I won't be able to afford anything. And then I'll resent him. And then we're going to fight and I'll be miserable and we're going to get divorced. And then their body responds as though they're already going through the fighting and the misery, right? And it hasn't even actually happened. So if this is your tendency, that you tend to be very anxious and you calamitize all the time, you really want to start learning cognitive CBT tools, cognitive behavioral therapy tools to help you learn to not be so hot, to catch yourself in your anxiety thinking and these anxious thinking patterns, and how to reduce that type of anxiety thinking, that calamitizing, that black and white thinking. And on that note, connected to that, the second tool that I really think everybody in today's life post-COVID needs to learn anyway, that would help all of us, is just some stress reduction tools where we can self-soothe. A lot of people need outside support to soothe themselves. They need to call their mother and cry, not that there's anything wrong with it, or they always need the support of a friend calming them down. I think when they get married, their wife or husband will be their in-house therapist that will calm them down, right? But their wife or husband may be going through the same crisis and they may not have the bandwidth to be that person. And every person responds differently to different tools. It's not one size fits all. When I meet patients, I always say, we're going to try different things on and you're going to see if it makes you feel better or not, because different things work for different people. So when you're dating, you already want to know those tools. So, and you may need to have practiced them daily. So they're really kind of part of your arsenal. And then don't wait till your anxiety is like code red, level 5. You really want to put them into play when they're like code white or code yellow, like to make them, with the terrorism issues where they have the different codes.
Yes.
Right, that anxiety tools need to be put into place early on, because when we have out of control anxiety, like we've already learned, it affects our thinking. It affects our thinking. Our thinking becomes reactive and our decision becomes reactive, reacting to fears, reacting to the calamitizing. But that's not our best decision. We want to make positive decisions and not reaction. The third thing I encourage people to do before they start dating, everybody, is to think and be honest about what you really want. Because every family has a bumper sticker of what they want for their child. They really do. To some families, it's Lakewood or bust. To some families, it's Schlickles or bust. To some families, it's financial success or bust. And you really want to feel what is comfortable for you, what you can handle, what you're ready for. A lot of people, when they're dating, as they get closer to the commitment, they realize they start to struggle with what they're committing to. They think it's about the guy, but it's really about the bumper sticker that every family has. We all have, in some neighborhoods, it's Ivy League or bust, but what, Aliyah or bust. But we want to see what really kind of matches us and fits us, because otherwise, if we're just sort of going along with things that other people think we ought to want or do or marry, and we aren't really, really comfortable with that, and every time we get close to that commitment, we're going to have commitment anxiety, because we're really stepping into a role that we weren't sure matched us. The fourth thing, and this is really directed to parents more than anyone else, is that we love our children, and as parents, we're trying to help them achieve all that they can achieve and to maximize on their potential. So very often parents, out of love, I promise, I know it's out of love, will correct a lot. The kids come home and they got an 85 on the test, and the parents will say, well, you didn't study. If you would have studied, you would have gotten 100. And, parents are constantly correcting out of love. But eventually what happens is that a lot of these children, when they become adults, they internalize these perfectionistic messages, and they become very perfectionistic themselves and very self-critical. And when they start to date, they have those same eyes on the person they're dating. And they really they see them through these critical, perfectionistic eyes. And they can't really appreciate the good there. They only see what they're not. They don't appreciate the person. They only see what they're not. So I really want, if you see that you have perfectionistic tendencies, to really work on yourself, that being perfect is not the goal. And if you feel like as a parent, you're giving that message, it's really going to interfere with your child's ability to appreciate who the person is. And John Gottman, who's a very famous researcher in the field of relationships, in John Gottman's research, he finds that negative and criticism and correcting has much more power to do harm in a relationship than positive things has to do, good in a relationship, do well. And in his research, he says that if couples have the same amount of correcting and negative and criticizing and correcting as they have positive, they don't have a healthy, thriving, happy relationship. Because then you would think, oh, it's equal, good and bad. No, because the negative has much more power to do harm than the positive has to do good. That we need to be able to see our partner and focus on the good and have much more fondness and admiration and respect than noticing what they're missing. And he even says in his research that of the couples he followed over 32 years, the same couples, thousands of couples, that the couples who were happy and stayed together and their marriages got better and better over the years were not necessarily the ones who were the most in love when they got married. In fact, they even have arranged marriages where, like, they barely knew each other. They didn't have any like Hasidic yeshivish arranged marriages, but they had like arranged marriages from India, where they would bring them back from India. He said, sometimes the people who were madly in love, after a few years, they got divorced, but the arranged marriages, they got better and better. And he said he found that really what helped people is the people who were able to focus on what they have that's good in their marriage and what's good in their partner, rather than focus on what's missing in their partner. That was the secret ingredients for a healthy relationship and for a healthy marriage. Now, a lot of people, they don't even have that with themselves. They're so self-critical. We learned in last week's Parsha about Saras and Lashon Hara, but the Lashon Hara that they talk about themselves is astonishing. They're really negative in their self-talk. And it's very hard for them not to also pass that along to their partner. And they see their partner, if not through their eyes, but through their parents' critical eyes. And they are always focusing on what's negative and not what's positive. It makes it very hard in those perfectionistic tendencies to find the person, because obviously no one's perfect, but it also makes it very hard to have a healthy relationship flourish, right? Because the negative and correcting and even suggesting is a negative behavior. If your partner comes out and says, "Oh, are you wearing this? Are you wearing this tonight?" That's a negative behavior. And a lot of people ask me how to have a deeper relationship, that they know how to get to the first date, they know how to get to the second date, but they don't know how to get like deeper in their relationships, right? And that's another tool in relationships. You really want to look at how you're developing your friendships, your long-term friendships. Do you burn through friends? Like every year you have a whole new set of friends. You don't, show compassion for them. You just have fun with them. Your friends, you have a fight and you have a whole series of friends that you fought with and don't speak to now. Kind of want to look at how you connect to people as a whole. And if that is flawed, you want to work on that, because that will affect your dating and your love relationships as an adult, right? Deep, close relationships are built on sort of an unconditional acceptance. They mess up, they apologize, you forgive them. You don't hold a grudge and decide never to speak to them again. So you really do want to look before you start dating at what your ability to connect to people is. And if you need help on that, on building rapport, on maintaining friendships, on maintaining close relationships, that's the time to get the help before you start dating. A lot of people I know have trouble connecting in a deep way to a potential partner and moving towards marriage. If they look at the patterns of their dating with their friendship, they also had trouble. They were very critical and if the friend in their mind failed them one time, that was it for them. We really want to make sure we have we set the stage with healthy relationships, long-term relationships, before they start to date. This is not a Build-A-Bear situation. We're not building our own perfect person here, where we get to choose how they're going to look and how they're going to respond and how much money they're going to make. We're taking a person in their entirety. And I find a lot of times people have imagined what their dream person is going to be like. And it's their fantasy. So they don't have to imagine someone who has flaws, right? Why should I imagine a flaw? I can imagine everything perfect. And then when they're dating, that perfectionistic tendency, they keep comparing the person they're dating to what they imagined. Their perfectionistic tendencies kick in. In reality, we are close to people and can love people that have flaws and that sometimes even disappoint us. So people who are naturally flexible can move away from that ideal and can appreciate who the person is. But there are people who have patterns, and they see them even when they are children and adolescents and, in seminary, they have patterns of being more rigid and more perfectionistic. and their mindset is more rigid. They're not in relationships. When we're rigid, we're like a bridge. When it's rigid and there's any kind of wind, the bridge will snap. In a relationship, we have to be flexible. And when we have flexibleness, when we have flexibility rather, in like a bridge and a storm, it will sway and it'll be able to get through the storm. In relationships, when we have flexibility, the relationship won't break down. So it really does help people to look at the patterns of how they connect to people in their life and work on them before they start to date, because otherwise it'll trip them up, if not in dating, in their Shana Rishana and beyond. And I just want to tell everyone who's listening that everything that we've talked about, everything is solvable. It's changeable. It can be overcome. There's not a single thing that we touched upon this evening that people haven't, that I've worked with, have not been able to overcome. And people, you know, sometimes we're surprised that good relationships take work, right? But everything worthwhile in life is A, not perfect, and B, requires effort. Raising children requires effort, a good career, building financial stability. It requires effort and learning tools sometimes, but it's worthwhile. So too, a good relationship requires sometimes tools and may require work to overcome certain things, but it's so worthwhile. All the research in positive psychology shows that if you're in a loving, supportive, unconditional relationship, that is the currency of happiness. So it may seem like, oh, I have so many things to work on, but it's worth it.
Definitely an investment into the rest of your life. So
yes,
everything, like not only in relationship, not only in money, and it's just satisfaction in life. So it's worth it at this earlier stage rather than later, or at whatever stage you're up to. I want to go back to something you said earlier about relationship OCD. Can you describe a little bit what that is? Because you said that the terms changed from an anxious attachment, and now people are using ROCD.
Right. So when we use a term in American in vernacular, everyday vernacular, we very often borrow terms from the DSM, from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. We borrow the terms from the disorder, but we use it in everyday life, and it's not a disorder, right? Like we've all used those terms. We've been like, oh my gosh, I was just like so depressed I couldn't get. You weren't clinically depressed. You know, you were upset, you were bummed, you were reacting normally to an upsetting situation, but you know, clinical depression is something completely different. So we use the term OCD for people who are cleaner than us or more religious than us sometimes too, right? It's very relative. But in its real diagnostic terms, someone who is so obsessed with a flaw, with ruminating and stewing and marinating over a small thing, and they can't get over it, and it prevents them from moving forward with a relationship with someone they really care about and they really respect and they really like. But as they get more and more into the relationship, more and more committed, that rigid, perfectionistic, black and white thinking takes over, and they just cannot ignore what really they know is like not a big deal, not a deal breaker, right? And they just can't stop thinking about it. They'll like ruminate about it and sleep at night and feel like, but what if I, you know, like I really liked her and I really like her personality and I met her and I was really into this relationship, but as we start getting more serious, we can't get over the fact that she has this lisp or he has this way of speaking or whatever it is. And we start to obsess about it. And I mentioned it before, it's like this helicopter of anxiety that's whirling and it looks for a place to land. And whatever it's landing on, even if we fixed it, it would just land upon the next thing, because the subtext of that, the undercurrent of that, is tremendous anxiety. And you know this, and it could be many of the variables that we discussed, why that anxiety is there. We touched upon many variables, so it depends on the person. You know, maybe they are, you know, fearful to end up stuck and they think their parents were stuck. Maybe they themselves had a very traumatic life experience within a relationship. But the anxiety starts there, and then it just like lands on different details and doesn't let them move forward.
So if
And
someone has
it
this,
needs help.
right, that was my question. If someone has this level of anxiety, specifically like the relationship with OCD, and like really hyper focusing on negative flaws, is that something they can overcome by themselves, or does it generally need some professional support?
So I think that if it's that severe, it can never hurt to get a professional opinion, right? A lot of times people who come to my practice, they come because their rabbi or their rebbe suggested they go see someone, because they came to the rebbe and they said, this girl is everything. She's this, she's this, she's this. We really have fun together. I really liked her. But now that we're about to get engaged, I can't stop thinking about this. Like I expected to feel like this, or I expected her to be like this, and she's not. Or her family, I didn't mind this before, but now I can't stop thinking about it, right? So the Rebbe will very often say, go get some tools. Go get some tools to overcome this. This is something that, so obviously most people would prefer to try and deal with things on their own or go to a friend. But really, I find that when they're in that level of distress, that they really care about the person. They don't want to break up with them, but they can't move forward into a committed relationship. That's a time to get help. Unfortunately, sometimes in my practice, I see people within the frum community and in the secular community where they've cycled in and out of the same relationship for years. They'll get about to get engaged, then they get anxiety, they find a flaw, a reason. They may even think it's a good reason at the time. They break up, and then they come back to them, and they can't stop thinking about them. Then the person maybe forgives them and takes them back. They almost get engaged. They break up again, and they go in and out and in and out, right? And or very often that person gives up on them and gets fed up and goes and marries someone else, and then they're devastated, and they can't stop thinking about that one who got away. That would be a typical scenario of someone with relationship OCD. They can't move forward, they can't move back. They feel stuck. It's like feeling like you're in a revolving door, but it's locked. Like you can't get out, you can't move forward, you're just stuck.
So you mentioned like when someone's about to get engaged, and so then they speak to whoever it is that recommended they come to speak to you or another therapist. How long does that take to get those tools? Because if someone's ready to get engaged and now we're going to start therapy and we're going to start like 3, 4, or 5 months, that can really derail the relationship.
Sometimes yes, sometimes no. I find that once sometimes people understand the biology of anxiety and what it does to them, and how it's like this big wet bucket of water that washes away all their emotion at that minute, and they should trust the gut that they were feeling up to that point, because now this is the anxiety talking, that is a very big relief, right? Because they kept thinking, and it normalizes it. They're thinking, well, maybe I should be looking at the fact that like I'm worried about her speech impediment. I'm just making up an example now. I wouldn't use a real example from my practice, obviously. Like maybe I should be bothering me. She's going to teach her children how to speak. He has a whole rationalization about it. She has a whole rationalization about it. Again, black and white thinking and calamitizing is a natural experience when we are flooded with anxiety. And just normalizing it and realizing that we understand that how our body, our amygdala, the emotional brain, sends a floodgate of hormones, and it affects our frontal. It makes our thinking completely wonky. And that, if we to learn tools, which could be immediate, how to reduce the anxiety, breathing and mantras, and there's many, many, many tools, and we reduce the anxiety, that a lot of times, once we take the anxiety off the table, it goes back into proportion. We realize, oh, that's not a big deal. There are so many much more important things that are worthwhile about this person. We just need to teach them tools to take the anxiety off the table. So it actually, very often, if they're really about to get engaged and we're that into it beforehand, it's a reaction to the anxiety of getting engaged, and they're really fine once you normalize it and give them some tools to get through it. And it's much faster. That's actually much faster when they're about to get engaged, and then they get relationship OCD. Then they get heightened and anxious. I find that that's easier. I find it's much harder when they have decades of patterns of not letting anyone close to them. Something that's really set over many years, that takes longer.
Okay, so it's not necessarily a long time to work through it.
No, it's not a long-term process at all. No. Everyone's walking in with different life experiences, some of them painful ones, and sometimes you just need to have insight into what's really going on.
Someone had a question, actually, when I put this out that I'm going to be talking to you. She wanted to know how to talk about, they're very anxious about talking about the financial situation. I'm assuming it means that they are not yet having a parnasa, and she doesn't know how to talk about it. It's making them very anxious. Can you address that?
That's a great question. And I'll tell you why it's a great question to whoever wrote it in. It's always a good question, but there are really the top research shows that there are the top 5 things that young couples fight about. And I bet without even knowing the research, you could guess what they are, the top 5 things, but the classic things: in-laws, intimacy, sex, raising children and agreeing on how to raise children, division of labor, money. And the number one out of all those 5 things, the number one thing is money. Now, all these top 5 things have a lot of subtext, right? A lot of subtext. We always have what they call in psychology a similar to me halo, meaning people who did what we did, that feels like just the right amount, right? If they're as religious as us, that's the right amount. If they're more religious than us, too extreme. Not religious as we are, we're skeptical of their sincerity, right? So it's the same thing with money. Like any way people are connected to money feels like we have that similar to me halo, right? If they spend more than we spend, we think maybe they're too materialistic. Maybe they don't have the right values. If they spend less than we spend, we think, they're not balabatish. It's not balabatish that they're not dressing a certain way. So we have this very interesting relativism. We judge people based on what we're used to doing. So a lot of times couples, it's not that they're walking in and they have big money issues, as much as if the person has a different relationship with money, we don't feel comfortable with that. We want them to match exactly the way we do with spending. But there's also a lot of subtext to these things. There's a lot of life experiences, many of them painful, about money. Sometimes people have had trauma about money. They've had parents who haven't had enough money, and they remember that very fearfully. And there's a lot of anxiety about money. Or, they had their language of love is gifts. And if they're not going to be able to get gifts, then they're not going to feel loved. So there's a lot of subtext about money, about all the topics I mentioned, but especially about money. And I think being able to communicate honestly about money and all the other topics is very important. And it comes down to sort of those tools of listening and validating, and then being able to be flexible and work together. If you don't understand the subtext of why someone is worried about this or feeling the same way they do, you're not really understanding their life story or the subtext behind it, right? If you have a couple and they're fighting about the honeymoon, and he wants to go on this all-out vacation and just spend all their wedding money on their honeymoon, and she just wants to save it, right? They'll end up fighting forever because he's going to say, you're so cheap, and this is our one and only honeymoon, and she's going to say you're irresponsible. But if he would say, why do you feel like that? Like, why is it so important for you to save? And she would say, like, why, trying to understand what life experiences led him to feel like he needs to live for today, then they would unpackage the painful, sometimes, experiences that led them to be where they are. She would share that her family maybe was evicted in the middle of the night, and they really lived hand to mouth, and there's nothing they could spend on that would give them the security of just having enough and saving and being safe. And he maybe would share that his father or mother saved for their retirement and never like took a vacation. They said, "Oh, I'll start to live when I retire." And then chas v'shalom, they passed away before they retired. So they never did anything that they had wanted to do. And he just learned, you have to live for today. You don't know what tomorrow will bring. And once they understand the reasons why they feel like that, that couple can then validate, give them what they need. It's not about compromising, because you can't tell someone who's afraid to spend money, compromise. Like it's like saying, give me your bones. It's so deep. It's so deep. But you can say, okay, now I understand. You have to do something fun now and not live for a day that may never come. What would be fun now that without spending all our money? We don't have to go to Paris. We don't have to fly first class. What if we went to Niagara Falls? We drove there. And he would say, I understand that saving is something you really need to feel secure, to sleep at night. How much money from our wedding money should we put away for that? What would make you feel safe? 5 months of rent, 3 months of rent, like what would really make you feel comfortable? Then they can come together because they're like, and they would feel closer. It would be a people growing argument because they would be able to share something about their life story that makes the person understand them better. So I think it's very important when you speak about money to make sure to take out your similar to me halo, your judgmentalness of it, and say like, well, we don't do that. We never spent on that. That's a luxury, right? To make sure you're not messaging that, and to try and understand the life story behind the way they feel like that. Maybe they're not chappy, but they want this because their language of love is gifts, right? And we need to learn, to understand their language of love, but it could be a surprise cupcake gift. It doesn't have to be a new pocketbook gift, but you need to be able to learn how to talk about money in a way that involves listening and trying to understand where that person's coming from. A lot of times the reason money becomes so tense is because there's a lot of judginess. Like, well, in my family, we never did that. Well, in your family, you just live for today and you never saved money. And it becomes very, whatever we did was right and very judgmental.
So I think this is very important, this whole thing. I love that we covered it. I think if I can read into this question, it was that she is embarrassed that they're not yet bringing parnasa and is very anxious about talking about that specific part.
I'm sure you're going to agree with this, and I'm sure you'd be able to say this without a mental health professional. If you are old enough to get married, you have to be old enough to learn how to communicate about difficult topics, because marriage is built on honesty and communication, right? You cannot have a marriage unless you can communicate about tough topics. And there'll be many, many tough topics that you need to communicate, and very emotionally laden topics, right? That you can't even anticipate. Your parents should be alive and well, but maybe in the future you want to bring an aging parent in and they've had a very bad experience with the mother-in-law living with them through their parents, and that's the last thing they want, and it becomes very sensitive, right? We really need to navigate the tools of talking honestly and about difficult topics. And if your partner is the type of person who is so judgmental that they can't listen and like meet you in that kind of conversation, then that's not a life partner you want to be able to live with, that you can't discuss emotional things and challenging things. You want someone who has a frustration tolerance that things may not go exactly the way they imagined. And you want someone who has the desire to communicate about difficult things, right? So I would just sit the person down and say, we're talking about sharing our money and our life and our dreams and our future. So, let's talk. Let's be practical now. I'm not earning any money. I plan to work towards my smicha or whatever it is for the next this amount of years. What do you think we should do for parnasa? What are some plans? Let's discuss this together, right? If this person cares about you, even if it's not what they expected, they need to know, right? They need to know that they thought that you were going to work and you're not planning to work. That's like, that's deceptive. That's not being honest. And, and it's a great practice to learn to talk about money. And lots of young couples have very different spending patterns, very different spending patterns. I mean, when the Shalom Task Force began premarital counseling, and there were a lot of things they wanted to put on there mattering that. And it's not done by mental professionals. It's done by rabbis and college teachers and volunteers. But one of the things that they said is, even if it's not done by mental professionals, it forces the young people to talk about things that they may not want to talk about, because we're putting it on the table for them.
Right.
Right, and they need to know. Right. Very good program.
Right. One final question?
Sure.
So this mom writes that her son was rejected about a year ago and still says no to everything that came in. How can she help him get over it?
So just to understand, he was rejected from a suggestion or from someone he was dating?
Someone he was dating.
Right. So he didn't process the rejection.
For a year so far.
And now he won't even go out anymore. He doesn't even want to put himself out there at all.
Right.
Right. It's very interesting because, in our generation, we had this term helicopter parents, but now there's a new term, a new phenomenon on the scene, and they call them lawnmower parents. And these are parents who make sure that there's like absolutely no ditches or bumps along the way, that everything is smooth for their kids, that their bubulas are with their friends in camp and not with the bully, and that in class they have the nice teacher, not the teacher who's mean and strict, and they just make sure everything is all right for them. And a lot of these kids, they've never had to apply for an internship, they've never had to apply for a job, right? They're a walk into the yeshiva they want because it's the community yeshiva. They don't have to deal with the rejection of applying to your stretch college and your safety college, and then you don't get into the college of your dreams. You have to go to your safety college. They haven't had the inevitable tools or steps to learn how to deal with rejection. But that is actually doing them a tremendous disservice, because it is our children's self-esteem is built by the things that it's hard that they overcome. It's not what we do for our children, but it's what they learn to do for themselves and what they learn to overcome that gives children self-esteem. So if a child is in a class and has a lot of friends where he isn't invited to some bar mitzvah, and he's a little hurt, he's a little insulted, that was the one fun bar mitzvah, and bar mitzvah he went to was just speeches and bar Torahs, and he missed the fun one, but he learns how to have resilience. He learns how to handle disappointment, and he learns that it's not the end of the world. He's not going to be invited to everything, right? Or if he applies for many jobs and his parents don't make phone calls and get him his job and he's not working for his uncle, but he really applies to a lot of jobs and he's rejected from a few that he really wanted, and they gave him 5 interviews and then he didn't get it. It's okay. He learns how to dust himself off, pull him up, his bootstraps up, and continue, and that he will eventually get a job, or he will have other friends who invite him to his bar mitzvah. That's how they learned the resiliency or the grit to handle rejection and to handle disappointment. But in our attempt to always protect our child's self-esteem, we're actually hurting it, because we're giving it like bubble wrap, and we're not giving them resiliency to handle the inevitable hits on self-esteem. If someone is rejected one time and disappointed, that hurts. And that is disappointment in life. But life is full of disappointments. Life is full of disappointments. And we can invest in a business and give it 10 years of our lives, and then the business goes under. I always think when the computer came out about all those people whose businesses were copy machines, like copying, printing, that's it. Like their whole business is gone because of an invention. And we have to have that resiliency for the inevitable hits. So really the question is, why can't the child recover in a year, and why they're so fearful to put themselves out there? Because even people who love and lose, and someone passes away, they're willing to climb out there on that emotional limb, right? Even though it came crashing down once before. Or if they got married and God forbid got divorced, people are willing to like take that risk again. Again, they climb back up the tree, climb out on that limb, even though it came crashing down before. So why is this person so afraid after that one rejection to even try to climb back on the limb again? And really, we really need to look deeper into their overall resiliency and their self-esteem. Like, is their self-esteem so frail and fragile that they can't take, they personalized it to the point where now they feel they just cannot take another hit, right? And by the way, it's very important when you are dating for people to realize that you could be the most amazing person and still not be the right person for that person. When people are dating, I see it all the time, that they, said no to this person, they said no to that person. And then when they do get engaged and they're so happy and they're so excited, their exes say, I don't even get it. They're not even, it's the right person for them. It felt right for them, right? This isn't an Olympic competition of who's getting the best girl or the best guy, right? So I feel like, we need to lay that foundation of it's not an Olympic competition. They rejected you. That means you're not the best. It's a lot of it is a lot of subtext. There's a lot that goes into who they pick. So you can explain that to them, but I really think they should explore with someone, not you, not the parent, some other trusted adult, why they're so devastated and not able to recover. And there may be more subtext there than meets the eye, or that he would share with his mother.
But then share with his mother especially. I think it's important that the mother wants to be helpful, and I think that's wonderful. But I don't know that the mother is the one who's going to actually solve this with and for the child, for the adult child.
No, right. Well, definitely if it's about like low self-esteem or not being able to have the resiliency, and I think her own anxiety may actually be compounding it. When a little kid falls and the parents go, oh, are you okay? Right? That's messaging to the kid, something bad happened. But if someone says, oops, okay, nothing happened, like they interpret the situation for that. Sometimes parents are so emotionally pulled in. And again, with the best of intentions, that they're actually messaging anxiety themselves.
Right. So we covered so much about anxiety. I think that there's a lot to unpack. And I'm so glad that we covered it all, because there's just, all that we're able to cover. There's so much more about dating
There's
anxiety.
so much more. I almost feel like we just began conversations. We began discussions that sort of touched upon a lot of tips of the iceberg. And then if something resonates with someone, then hopefully they'll be able to explore that more deeply. And we just sort of like covered a lot of different topics.
Right. So how can someone reach you?
Oh, thank you for asking. So if someone has questions, and I know especially with dating, it's very hard to have questions in a public forum, they're welcome to email me. I do get back. I do email them. And the fastest email to reach me on is I chair the psych department at Turo, so it's my Turo email. It's Naomi.Klapper, Klapper, Naomi.Klapper@gmail.com. I also have a website, and if they get my email, but they look at clappertherapy.com, they'll find my email and they'll be able to click it and email me through that as well. It is hard to ask questions in a public forum, because what are you really going to say if you're dating someone? Right. You're going to say, oh, my relationship is perfect. This is about my neighbor's relationship. So it is easier to email and have a more private conversation.
And we'll put your email and your website in the show notes as well.
Okay, thank you. That's a great idea. Thank you so much, Devora.
All right, thank you so much for this conversation, and I think it's been very helpful to me and for those who will listen. So thank you so much. And I also want to thank Naomi Klapper from Mass for connecting us. So
thank you, and I want to give you a big yasher koach. I think it's always wonderful when we take a conversation that's difficult, like your second to last question about money, and we put it on the table. Because we take something that feels like this big kind of monster, like relationship anxiety. And when we put it on the table and we start talking about it, it really makes it less scary. Like they become like little gremlins. And, some of those gremlins are actually kind of cute, like they're manageable. So I really applaud you for taking these tough conversations, not just about dating, but all the conversations that you have in your podcast, and being willing to put them on the table and unpackage them a little bit to help people. So yes, koach.
Thank you so much, Naomi.
Welcome. Nice to meet you. Have a great night.
Good night.
And you can find more from Shidduch U at our website at adaiad.org. That's all A's, ADAIAD.org, on the Shidduch U page. Or you can also find us on Instagram and Facebook. And if you have any questions, definitely reach out to us at info@adaiad.org.